Shaquille O'Neal walked into the mall, his towering figure moving with quiet confidence. Wearing a simple black t-shirt, sunglasses, and a baseball cap pulled low, he blended into the crowd, not as a star, not as a legend, but just as an ordinary man walking through the luxurious, gleaming hallways. He quietly observed everything around him: polished marble floors, perfectly groomed shops, and a quiet atmosphere soaked in opulence. Yet no one recognized him. From afar, a security guard squinted, his gaze full of suspicion. He straightened up and watched Shaq from head to toe, and within seconds, he made a decision. "Hey, this place isn't for you. Move along." Shaq didn't argue. He didn't respond. He just stood still for a moment, quietly noting everything: the warm smiles for the well-dressed customers, the indifferent glances for those who didn't fit the mold of the place. Then, with a slow, decisive gesture, he turned and left. The security guard crossed his arms, satisfied as he watched Shaq leave. But little did he know, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And tomorrow, Shaquille O'Neal would return. But this time, he wouldn't just be an ordinary customer. What do you think will happen next? Leave a comment below. If you enjoy dramatic and inspiring stories like this, like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. The luxurious mall gleams under the dazzling lights. The marble floors reflect the silhouettes of wealthy customers, walking in their extravagant outfits, carrying the scent of expensive perfume that blends into the air. The posh stores line the hallways, showcasing pricey fashion collections, where each item costs more than an average person's monthly salary. Amidst it all, a tall man appears like a tower. Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend with extraordinary height, steps in with calm composure. He's not wearing a luxury suit, nor sparkling designer shoes. Just a simple black t-shirt, sunglasses, and a baseball cap pulled low. He didn't come to make a scene. Today, he just wanted to enjoy an ordinary day, like everyone else. But as soon as he entered, a sharp gaze locked onto him. At the end of the hallway, a security guard stood with his arms crossed, his gaze full of scrutiny. He didn't move immediately, just stood there, watching. When Shaq approached an upscale fashion store, he suddenly blocked his way. "What are you doing here?" The voice, filled with suspicion, was anything but friendly. Shaq slowly turned his head, looking down at the man who was nearly 2 heads shorter than him. He didn't hurry to respond, simply raising an eyebrow behind his sunglasses. "I'm just looking around," he said, his voice deep and calm but strong. The security guard squinted, sizing him up from head to toe. No prominent brand logos, no jewelry to indicate wealth. "This place isn't for you. Move along." The guard's voice had shifted from suspicion to an order. Just then, another man walked by, a businessman in a finely tailored suit, his polished shoes reflecting the lights. The guard immediately changed his attitude, bowing his head and opening the door with a smile, as if that greeting were reserved only for those with money. Shaq didn't respond right away. He just stood still, observing the moment, taking note of every detail. Something felt wrong. He didn't argue, didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't protest. He simply walked out quietly, but inside a fire had been ignited. They didn't know who he was. They only saw what they wanted to see, and Shaquille O'Neal knew that the game was just beginning. Shaq walked out of the shopping mall with a heavy heart. The way the security staff treated him wasn't just a random act. It was a reflection of an invisible system that had deeply ingrained itself in this place. The indifference toward him, the warm welcome toward the man in the suit, everything felt too natural, as if that was how things were always meant to unfold. The next day, Shaq returned, still wearing his black t-shirt, sunglasses, and a cap pulled low. He didn't want to attract attention, but this time he wasn't just a customer. He silently observed, paying attention to the smallest details, the fleeting expressions on the staff's faces, the glances they cast over the customers to evaluate them in an instant. In front of a luxurious jewelry store, a modest couple walked in. They weren't wearing designer clothes, didn't have expensive accessories, but they stood tall, their eager eyes fixed on the sparkling items behind the glass. No staff greeted them. They stood there for a moment, hesitant, then made their way to the display counter. A minute passed, then 2, then 3. The staff remained busy with their work or pretended not to see them. When the woman tried to speak, a sales assistant glanced over and responded curtly, without a smile. The couple exchanged a confused glance, then quickly left the store, walking silently as if they had never been there. Right after, a woman in an extravagant dress entered. Immediately, 2 staff members rushed toward her with bright smiles. A glass of champagne was brought out, soft greetings were exchanged, and the atmosphere immediately became completely different. Shaq stood from a distance, witnessing it all. Everything unfolded exactly as it had the day before, as though it had been programmed. He continued to stroll around the mall, paying closer attention to every small detail. The security staff stood in positions where they could easily observe customers who appeared more modest, their eyes following every step of those people as if waiting for a mistake. The servers at upscale restaurants smiled at those dressed in expensive clothing, but when it came to a less flashy customer, their tone became dry, impatient. Managers walked by, glancing at the customers for an instant, then quickly deciding who was worthy of a greeting and who didn't deserve even a nod. Finally, Shaq entered the coffee shop. In front of him, a glamorous woman stood at the counter, and as soon as the barista saw her, a smile appeared. "Hello, as usual?" the barista asked. The woman smiled lightly and nodded. No one asked her to pay immediately, and there were no questions about whether she would pay with cash or card. When it was Shaq's turn, the staff's attitude immediately changed. The smile that had been there earlier disappeared, and the tone turned cold. "What do you want?" No greeting, no small talk. Shaq looked directly into the barista's eyes and slowly said, "A black coffee." The barista quickly input the order, but instead of asking if he wanted anything else, the curt voice rang out, "Pay now, cash or card." Shaq paused for a moment, his gaze drifting toward the woman who had just received her coffee without opening her wallet. He looked back at the barista. "The woman before me didn't pay," he said slowly. The barista hesitated for a second, then shrugged as if it didn't matter. "Store policy." Shaq tilted his head, his voice deeper now. "Policy? Regular customers can pay later," the barista replied without looking him in the eye. Shaq took the coffee, saying nothing further. But this time, inside him wasn't just the fleeting irritation, it was an anger that was slowly growing. He had seen it, clearly and undeniably. This shopping mall didn't need written rules. It operated on an invisible system, where unwritten rules had become law. No one needed to say anything because everyone here instinctively knew how to behave. They knew who deserved to be treated warmly, who deserved to be ignored. They knew who could walk through the doors without being stopped, and who would be watched every step of the way. What angered Shaq the most wasn't the way they treated him, but the thought that thousands of other people had been treated the same way. People who didn't have striking height, didn't have big names, didn't have millions of dollars to make them stand out. People who had to endure this discrimination without being able to do anything about it. Shaq walked out of the coffee shop, his eyes scanning the entire shopping mall. He had enough evidence, not just from what he saw, but also from the way people here behaved so naturally, as though this injustice was a given. He took a deep breath, tasting the bitterness of the coffee on his tongue, but the bitterness that hurt more was deep in his chest. He couldn't let this go. He would come back, but next time, he wouldn't just be there to observe. Shaq slowly walked down the corridor of the shopping mall, each breath measured and deep, his gaze calm, yet filled with a rising, unnameable discomfort inside him. He had seen what he needed to see, witnessed firsthand how the system operated smoothly, as if it had been designed long ago to eliminate those who didn't fit their ideal customer profile. He knew he wasn't the only one who had experienced this, but today, he was the only one who could do something about it. Just as he was about to leave the coffee shop, a familiar figure appeared right in front of him. It was the same security guard from yesterday, still standing with his arms crossed in smug arrogance, still giving him that scrutinizing, undisguised look. Shaq recognized that look, the look of people who believe they have absolute power in the small space they control. "I told you, you're not allowed here," came the firm, unyielding voice. Shaq stopped in his tracks, his broad shoulders squared, like a solid wall suddenly erected in the midst of this opulent mall. This time, he didn't walk away like he did before. Instead, he locked eyes with the guard, making sure his presence was undeniably felt. "Are you sure this place isn't for me?" His voice was low, not raised, but powerful enough to make the surrounding space feel momentarily suspended. The guard squinted, not backing down. For him, this wasn't a conversation, it was a struggle for power, and he was certain he held the upper hand. "Definitely," came the sharp reply, tinged with an underlying challenge. Shaq didn't respond immediately. He let the silence linger, allowing the guard to feel the weight of his presence, to realize that this time, the man before him wasn't someone easily dismissed. Around them, eyes quietly observed. Some customers pretended not to care, but they stole glances at the scene. The baristas in the coffee shop quickly looked away, as if afraid they might be pulled into the drama. No one spoke a word, but the air grew palpably tense. Shaq scanned the room, not missing any reaction. The averted eyes, the forced smiles, the subtle shakes of heads, all of it was there. He wasn't just facing a security guard. He was up against an entire system nurtured on discrimination. The guard took a step forward, his tone hardening. "I don't want to have to ask again." Shaq tilted his head, his eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Ask again?" The guard crossed his arms, his face growing even more arrogant. "You've been warned. We don't want people like you here." That phrase ignited something in Shaq's mind. People like him? Not Shaquille O'Neal, not a former NBA legend, not a millionaire, an investor, a successful businessman. It wasn't about what he had accomplished or what he owned. It was about those whom the guard deemed unworthy of being there. People who didn't wear designer clothes. People who didn't walk in with the confidence of the rich. People who didn't belong on the list of customers worth serving. Shaq clenched his jaw, but not in anger. He was holding back a smile. A part of him wanted to reveal his identity right then and there, to see the guard's face twist in panic, to enjoy watching him squirm as he realized that the man he was trying to kick out wasn't just anyone. But another part of him understood that doing so wouldn't change a thing. If he were allowed to stay today just because they recognized who he was, others would continue to be thrown out. And that was the real issue. Shaq took a deep breath, maintaining a steady gaze, then took a step back. But it wasn't a retreat. It was a quiet warning. "Fine," he said, his tone eerily calm. "I'll leave today." The guard smirked, a trace of self-satisfaction in his eyes, as if he had won. But before he could savor the moment, Shaq continued, his voice slow, heavy, like thunder before the storm. "But tomorrow, I'll be back." The guard furrowed his brows, a hint of confusion crossing his rigid face. "Back? To do what?" Shaq offered a thin smile, his eyes gleaming with cold determination. "To make sure no one else ever hears those words again." With that, he turned and walked away slowly, but with absolute certainty. This time, he wasn't just a customer thrown out of a shopping mall. This time, he was someone who had seen the truth, and he knew exactly what he was going to do next. The next morning, the mall still shone brightly under the lavish lights, everything running smoothly as if nothing had ever happened. The employees in their crisp uniforms continued to smile at the upscale customers, and the managers still glided through the halls, indifferent to those who didn't meet their standards. Outside, the transparent glass doors reflected the images of those entering, and among them Shaquille O'Neal appeared once again. But this time he was not alone. Striding through the main doors, Shaq walked with a slow but steady gait, flanked by tall men dressed casually, yet unmistakably, his personal security. They weren't wearing expensive suits, nor were they sporting earpieces like the bodyguards in movies, but they were there, exuding an air of authority. Eyes began to turn towards them. Sales staff hesitated briefly when they saw a tall, confident man walking without the need to step aside or hesitate. No one dared to stop him, but no one greeted him either. Only one person appeared. As Shaq neared the center area, a security guard appeared in front of him, almost instinctively. Alongside the man from yesterday, with the same scrutinizing eyes full of suspicion and the smug attitude believing he controlled everything. "You're back again?" His tone, the same as before, but today the situation had changed. Shaq didn't stop immediately. He took a few more steps, reducing the distance between them just enough for the guard to clearly feel the weight of his gaze. When he finally stopped, Shaq slowly removed his sunglasses, revealing sharp eyes that locked onto the guard. "Are you sure you want to kick me out?" His voice was calm, not loud, but it echoed like a drum in the silent space. The guard furrowed his brow slightly, but still didn't understand the situation. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain his authority, quickly scanning Shaq's simple outfit as though searching for a reason to continue ejecting him. "I've already told you, this place isn't for—" Before he could finish, a frantic voice came from behind. "Sir, are you Shaquille O'Neal?" A well-dressed man hurried over, his face pale. It was no one other than the mall manager, responsible for overseeing all the activities there. When his eyes met Shaq's face, no longer hidden by sunglasses, a genuine fear flashed across his face. The entire mall seemed to pause. Some employees from nearby stores began to look over, and customers passing by also stopped to observe. The guard furrowed his brows, glanced at the manager, then back at Shaq, trying to make sense of what was happening. Shaq stood still, maintaining his calm yet powerful demeanor. He didn't speak any further, simply staring at the security guard, allowing the silence to stretch, letting the guard feel the pressure mounting on him. For a few seconds, the guard still didn't understand what was happening. But then, like a cold wave crashing over him, he began to connect the dots. The manager's panic, the eyes focused on Shaq, his towering height, his strong gait, and unmistakable presence. And then he realized. The guard's face slowly drained of color, his lips parting but unable to speak. Shaq kept his eyes fixed on him. "So now, do you still want to say who doesn't belong here?" The words rang out, deep and sharp like a knife cutting through the air. The guard stiffened, unable to respond. The mall manager swallowed nervously, stepped forward, and tried to smooth things over. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding here." But Shaq raised his hand, a simple gesture that was enough to silence him instantly. Shaq's gaze shifted from the guard to the manager, sweeping over the entire space around them. Employees in the distance, curious customers who had stopped to watch, and service staff still working but clearly listening to everything. This system had been operating in the shadows for too long, and today it had been brought into the light. But Shaq wasn't in a rush to finish it. He wasn't here just to win a small confrontation. He wasn't here to prove he couldn't be kicked out. He was here to make sure everyone saw this, would remember this, and would never let it happen to anyone else again. Shaq turned, glancing at those around him, then slowly returned his gaze to the manager. "I think it's time we had a serious conversation." And this time, no one dared to stop him. The room fell into a tense silence. No more hurried footsteps of customers. No more polite greetings between staff and VIP guests. No more the fake hustle and bustle that the mall wore every day. At this moment, all that was left was confrontation. Shaquille O'Neal stood there, as solid as a steel wall, his eyes fixed on the manager and the security guard, those who had been clinging to their small amount of power until now. He took out his phone, swiped the screen a few times, then held it up. "Do you think this is just a personal matter between me and the guard? Number? This is how this mall treats everyone. I'm going to show you." He tapped on an app, opened the mall's online reviews, and read aloud in the quiet space, "This mall only respects the rich." The security guard looks at me like I'm a thief, following me from store to store. The salespeople look down on me just because I'm not wearing designer clothes. The old reviews, filled with frustration, echoed through the air like mirrors reflecting a harsh reality that no one wanted to acknowledge. The mall manager turned pale, his eyes shifting nervously, trying to find an excuse but unable to. The security guard, who had just ordered Shaq to leave twice in a row, stood frozen like a statue, breathing heavily, his hands unconsciously clenched in front of his chest as if trying to hold on to the last bit of power he had left. Shaq looked around, his sharp gaze scanning the customers, the staff, and those who had witnessed the entire event from beginning to end. He took a deep breath and then spoke loudly. "Who here has ever been treated like this?" No one answered immediately, but then a hand slowly rose. A woman near the high-end clothing store, wearing a simple dress with no extravagant jewelry, looked at Shaq, her eyes no longer hesitant. "I have." Next, another hand went up, a middle-aged man wearing an old shirt, the kind of person who came in just to buy a gift for his child. "They acted like I didn't exist. I asked for the price of something and they didn't even bother to answer." Another hand raised, then another. Soon, the whole corner of the room was buzzing. Whispers quickly turned into clear statements, then into real stories. I walked into a shoe store and they told me, "Don't touch it if you're not planning to buy it." They watched me like I was going to steal something. I tried on a dress and the staff looked me up and down, then shook their heads like I wasn't good enough to wear it. Shaq stood there listening to it all. He said nothing, letting the truth speak for itself. The manager panicked, turning to the staff, his eyes showing real fear, not concern for his image, but for the worry of realizing that the lies of this system were being exposed in front of dozens of people. The wealthy customers standing nearby, those who usually received the best service, began to feel that something was off. Some quietly stepped back, trying to avoid getting pulled into this situation. But it was too late. The truth had been laid bare, and Shaq was not done. He put the phone away, took a step toward the manager who was sweating coldly, his voice steady and unwavering. "This is not a personal issue between me and one security guard. This is the system that you created. You don't need a sign to tell people they're not welcome. You've done that with your attitude, with your eyes, with your subtle discrimination. You've done it every day, over and over, until it became part of this mall." The manager opened his mouth, but couldn't speak. Shaq nodded toward the crowd raising their hands, the forgotten people, the customers who had been disregarded. And now, everyone has seen it. The room fell deathly silent. All that was left were the confused eyes of those who had been running this system in the shadows for far too long. But the darkness had been torn open, and there was no turning back. The atmosphere in the director's office was so quiet that you could hear the ticking of the clock hanging on the wall. The room was spacious, decorated with expensive furniture, creating a sense of luxury, yet it felt cold. Shaq stood in front of the glossy wooden desk, facing the man who had created the discriminatory system he had just exposed. Sitting comfortably in a high-end leather chair, Lancaster maintained the calm demeanor of someone who was accustomed to controlling everything within reach. He was not flustered, not afraid, even smiling slightly as if Shaq were merely an unexpected guest, not someone who had just shaken the entire shopping mall. "Shaquille O'Neal," Lancaster said in a calm voice, slightly tilting his head to observe him. "It's an honor to meet you, but I hear you have a problem with the way we operate." Shaq did not sit down in the chair opposite. He did not need any formal greetings. He stared directly into Lancaster's eyes, his voice steady but sharp as a knife. "Is the way you operate about excluding people you don't like?" Lancaster raised an eyebrow, seeming more amused than surprised. He shrugged, his tone indifferent as if this was common knowledge. "Exclude? Not exactly. We simply serve a certain group of clients." Shaq narrowed his eyes, replaying everything he had witnessed. The condescending glances, the cold words, the scrutinizing looks from the security, the working-class couples being ignored as if they were invisible. No need for signs, no need for written rules, but the system ran as smoothly as a program machine, subtly and ruthlessly eliminating those who didn't fit. "A certain group of clients," Shaq repeated, his voice low but carrying the weight of someone who wouldn't accept cheap excuses. Lancaster nodded, his gaze unwavering. "You have to understand. Customers come here to seek a luxurious experience. We simply ensure that experience isn't interrupted by unsuitable factors." Shaq didn't blink or show any emotion. He simply took his phone from his jacket pocket, placed it on the table, and hit record. "We ensure that unsuitable people don't affect the experience," Lancaster's voice echoed in the quiet room, each word clear and undeniable. Shaq stared at him, his eyes cold like a judgment. "You just ruined your career." For a moment, Lancaster's smile faltered. He still tried to maintain his calm, but there was a slight tremor in his eyes, a subtle pause in his breath. He lowered his gaze to the phone, then looked back at Shaq, now with a hint of caution. "You think a recording can do anything to me?" Lancaster leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, trying to regain his confidence. "Who are you? A basketball star. You can't change the way a system operates with just a few words." Shaq remained in place, unwavering. "No, I can't," he said, his voice still calm, "but I can make the whole world hear it." Lancaster's jaw tightened, but he kept his calm exterior. He was too used to power, too used to controlling information, too used to resolving matters with a call, a payment, or a veiled threat. But this time, the person in front of him was not an expendable employee, not a customer who could be ignored, not someone easily silenced. Shaquille O'Neal was not just a former athlete. He was a businessman, an influencer, a symbol of fairness and strength. And if he brought this story to the public, everything would explode in a way Lancaster could not control. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Lancaster no longer smiled. He stared at Shaq for a long time, as if trying to guess whether this was a threat or an irreversible statement. "What do you want?" His voice was deeper now, lacking the initial arrogance. Shaq placed both hands on the table, leaning forward until the distance between him and Lancaster was only a hand's reach. "I want change." Lancaster blinked, slightly frowning. "Change?" Shaq nodded, no further explanation needed. He didn't need to elaborate. Lancaster knew exactly what that meant. A shopping mall where all customers are welcomed equally. A system where employees are not forced to choose who to treat well and who to ignore. A place where people are respected, not because of what they wear, but because of who they are. Lancaster took a slow breath, not taking his eyes off the man before him. Throughout his career, he had faced more powerful people, wealthier businessmen, investors willing to flip the game to secure their benefits. But no one had ever stood before him with such a simple yet powerful demand. Shaq stood up, picked up his phone, and never took his eyes off Lancaster. "If you don't want to change, I assure you, you won't have the chance to continue running this place." The room fell into prolonged silence. Lancaster stared at Shaq, his eyes as sharp as a predator trying to find a way out of an unfavorable situation. But in that moment, he understood that this battle had already been decided. Shaq didn't need to threaten. He simply presented an unavoidable truth. And for the first time, Lancaster knew he had lost. Lancaster sat silently in his chair, gripping the leather armrests, his sharp eyes no longer holding the arrogant confidence they had earlier. Shaq didn't need to emphasize anything more, didn't need to threaten or give any further warnings. What he had said was enough for Lancaster to understand that the game was no longer in his control. Shaq looked at him one last time, his gaze unwavering. Slowly, he pulled out his phone, swiped the screen lightly, and pressed the live streaming icon. In just a few seconds, the entire world became an audience to this conversation. "Hello, everyone," his deep voice rang out on screen. I'm standing in the CEO's office of this shopping mall where I just had a rather interesting conversation." He turned the screen around and pointed it straight at Lancaster, who remained seated, his face tense but trying to remain calm. "This is Lancaster, the man who has run this place with a policy that I think everyone should know about." Shaq tapped the screen and played back the recorded audio. "We ensure that unsuitable people do not affect the experience." Lancaster's careless, arrogant words echoed in the quiet office space, but within seconds they had traveled beyond these walls, spreading across the internet. The storm began. Live stream comments began flooding in, furious remarks from thousands of people arriving in mere seconds. "Is this really their true face? I've been here before and felt mistreated. Now I understand why. Boycott this place. We can't let someone like this keep controlling customer service." Shaq kept the camera steady, his eyes fixed on Lancaster. He began shifting in his seat, his hands subconsciously interlacing, his face reddening with both anger and anxiety. This was no longer a private conversation. This was the collapse of a system he had built for years. Shaq looked at him, lowering his voice, but each word carried enough weight to crush any defense. "Do you think you can decide who deserves to be treated like a human and who doesn't? No, Lancaster, you don't have that right. And now, the whole world knows the truth." Outside the office, the noise began to rise. The entire mall had learned of the situation. Employees whispered. Customers stopped to look at their phone screens. Murmurs filled the air. The news spread faster than anything Lancaster could have ever imagined. Major media outlets began reporting. Social media platforms erupted. The internet exploded. Lancaster slammed both hands down on the desk, his face no longer maintaining its calm. He understood what this meant. This wasn't just a minor scandal that could be extinguished with a simple apology article. This was a real crisis. The office door flew open. A group of senior executives from the mall entered, their faces as cold as ice. No words were needed, but their eyes said it all. They had seen the recording. They had seen the public's reaction. And they knew there was no turning back. Lancaster picked up his phone, attempting to call someone, but a man, head of the board of directors, stepped forward, placed a sheet of paper on the table, and spoke in a brief, decisive tone. "Lancaster, you're fired. Immediately." Lancaster's face turned pale. He stared at the paper, then looked around the room, as if searching for an escape. But there was no way out. He opened his mouth to say something, but the eyes of everyone in the room made one thing clear. It was over. Shaq stood there, silently observing as a whole system collapsed right before his eyes. No lengthy debates, no secret meetings for discussion. The truth had destroyed the one who had manipulated everything. Another security guard entered, this time not to eject an ordinary customer from the mall, but to escort the former CEO out of the place he had once ruled. Lancaster fumed, ready to resist, but as he walked into the hallway, the whispers, the eyes, and the phones raised to record each step left him with no choice. He bowed his head, walking silently in shame, leaving the mall for the last time. Shaq remained still, watching until Lancaster's figure disappeared behind the door. A storm had swept through the mall, but he knew this was just the beginning. The issue wasn't just one person, it was a culture that had seeped deeply into this place. He turned around, looking directly at the people in the room. The board of directors, the employees, the senior managers. The people holding the power to make change. He took a deep breath, his eyes gleaming with unwavering resolve. "Now," he said slowly, "we'll talk about how to fix all of this." And this time, no one dared ignore him. The atmosphere in the shopping mall changed dramatically after Lancaster was expelled from the building. Gone were the fearful glances at the sight of his power and the wariness of low-level employees when they accidentally entered areas they weren't supposed to be in. But the storm was just beginning, and Shaq knew that firing one person couldn't change an entire system that had deeply ingrained itself in this place for so long. He looked around and saw employees still standing silently in the hallway corners, lower-level managers exchanging worried glances, and janitors cleaning but still secretly observing. They still didn't believe that things could truly change. Shaq turned to the highest-ranking manager left in the building, who still hadn't recovered from the recent events. "Call all employees into the main meeting room," he said, his voice low and resolute. "I want to hear the truth from them." No one objected. No one dared. Never before in the history of this mall had there been a meeting like this. Not a meeting of senior management, not a confidential policy discussion. For the first time, every employee was present. Salespeople, security staff, janitors, coffee shop workers, office staff, even those working behind the scenes that customers never saw. They stood crowded in the large room, some still hesitant, some nervously awaiting, as they had never been asked for their opinion before. Shaq stood in front of them, with no podium, no microphone, only his strong voice echoing in the room full of people waiting for something they had never dared to hope for. He scanned the room, and then spoke slowly but clearly. "I know that not all of you want to run this mall this way. I know some of you have witnessed the injustice but couldn't do anything. Today, I want you to tell me the truth." No one spoke immediately. An awkward silence spread across the room, but then, from the back of the room, a voice trembled but was determined. "The managers threatened to fire us if we oppose this way of doing things." All eyes turned to the speaker, a young sales associate, his hands instinctively clenching together as if he had just spoken an unspeakable truth. But when he saw Shaq looking at him with no judgment, no reprimand, only patience and listening, he continued. "We couldn't do anything because everyone is afraid of losing their jobs." Like an unspoken signal, other voices began to rise. "We were told to focus on customers who seemed wealthy and let the others fend for themselves. If we didn't comply, the manager would note it in our records, and the next evaluation would be the reason for firing us. There was a time I helped a customer not wearing designer clothes, and the manager pulled me into a room and warned me, 'Don't waste time with people like that.' The confessions poured out, no longer fearful, no longer holding back. Everything that had been hidden was now brought to light. Shaq stood in silence, listening, not interrupting, not urging them on. He let them speak, let them release what they had been holding in for so long. As the voices gradually quieted, Shaq took a step forward, his eyes locking onto each person in turn, not missing anyone. "From today, that will change." The room fell silent. No one dared believe what they had just heard. Shaq continued, his voice steady, but carrying the weight of an irrevocable promise. "There will no longer be anyone who is forced to treat a customer better just because they're wearing designer clothes. There will no longer be anyone who is watched because of their appearance. No more employees being forced to comply with unjust rules out of fear of losing their jobs." He took a deep breath, his eyes shining with unwavering determination. From now on, anyone who faces discrimination, whether a customer or an employee, will have the right to speak up. And if anyone threatens or seeks revenge against you, I want to know immediately. The looks in the room began to change. Doubt gave way to a glimmer of hope, small but enough to stir those who had grown used to keeping their heads down. A cafe worker stood up, her voice still tentative. If we speak up, will we really be protected? Shaq nodded without hesitation. Not only will you be protected, you will be the ones to help change this place. Another sales associate spoke up, this time with a mixture of anger. What about the old managers, the ones who turned this mall into a place where only the wealthy mattered? Shaq looked directly at the woman who had spoken, then scanned the room. Anyone who doesn't want to change can leave today. Silence once again overtook the room, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the realization that the old order had been erased. The meeting lasted longer than any meeting the mall had ever held. For the first time, employees weren't forced to listen to orders from above, but were able to voice their thoughts without fear of consequences. Ideas, concerns, and suggestions were raised, and Shaq took note of them all. When the meeting ended, the employees walked out of the room with a feeling they had never had before, one of true change. Shaq stood outside, watching them walk by with different expressions on their faces. Some were still hesitant, some were starting to believe, but most importantly, they knew things would never be the same again. He turned to a senior manager who had stayed behind, someone who had chosen to stand with the employees rather than maintain the old system. Now, Shaq said, his voice low but powerful, we begin the real work. And this time, no one would stop him. The atmosphere in the shopping center was still tense, but not out of fear like before. It was because of a transformation that was taking place. The employees walked out of the meeting room with mixed emotions. Some were filled with hope, some were still anxious, and others tried to maintain composure, but their hearts were in turmoil. Shaq stood in the grand lobby, a place where only wealthy customers once dared to comfortably enjoy the lavish atmosphere. Now, he was redefining the rules, not with empty words on paper, but with real actions. He looked around, his gaze meeting each employee, each manager, each security guard standing, waiting for what was coming next. They knew he wouldn't stop at promises, and they were listening. From today, there are 3 things everyone in this shopping center needs to remember, Shaq said, his voice deep but strong, echoing in the silent space. Every customer is welcome. A few employees exchanged glances, some biting their lips as if trying to hide a slight smile. Every employee is respected. In the back, a coffee shop worker subtly clenched the towel in their hands, their eyes flashing with a hint of hope. And anyone who continues to discriminate will be removed. Silence enveloped the room. No more whispering, no more avoiding glances. Shaq's words felt like a verdict, echoing in a place where injustice had reigned for too long. The employees looked at each other. Some took a deep breath. Some still couldn't believe that things would change. Some were visibly overjoyed, but even some senior managers began to feel uncomfortable. On the right side, a man in a sharp suit crossed his arms and pressed his lips together. He was one of the middle managers who had been with the shopping center for years, one of the people who had maintained the old culture. No one had ever seen him openly display discriminatory behavior, but he had always silently agreed with it, always giving selective instructions, focusing only on potential customers, ignoring those who didn't bring in high profits. He cleared his throat and spoke, his tone somewhat sarcastic mixed with caution. "Change is good, but I'm afraid this could affect the shopping center's reputation. High-end customers won't like it if this environment becomes too mainstream." Murmurs spread through the room. Some employees lowered their heads, looking worried by his words, but Shaq remained unfazed. He took a step forward, staring straight at the man, his voice calm but carrying an invisible weight. "If you think the reputation of this shopping center depends on excluding regular customers, then perhaps you are the one who doesn't belong here." The manager stiffened for a moment, his eyes blinking slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he just heard. But before he could respond, Shaq continued, not giving anyone a chance to overshadow his message. "If anyone feels uncomfortable with this rule, the door is always open for you to leave." A simple statement, but it carried the power of a revolution. The senior managers exchanged hesitant glances. Some employees from the old group seemed uneasy, but no one dared to immediately object. Some had understood Shaq's message. He was not here to negotiate. He was here to make a change. Some bit their lips, some lowered their heads, but no one stepped out of line. The heavy atmosphere lingered for a few seconds before someone spoke. A young saleswoman who had once been reprimanded by management for helping a customer who didn't appear wealthy slowly stepped forward. She took a deep breath and raised her head to look at Shaq, her voice trembling but full of resolve. "I'll stay." Her words were like a beam of light cutting through the tense room. Another employee spoke up. "So will I." Next, a barista from the coffee shop. "I want to see this shopping center change." One by one, employees began speaking out, no longer afraid, no longer hesitating. They weren't just choosing to stay, they were choosing to stand with change. Shaq nodded, his eyes reflecting respect for them. He turned back, his gaze focused on the silent managers. "What about you?" Some quietly nodded, some seemed reluctant but knew there was no other way. But then, the man in the sharp suit, still holding his earlier resolute attitude, took a deep breath, adjusted his collar, and then took a step back. "I'm sorry, but I can't work in an environment like this." No one stopped him. No one tried to convince him. He walked out of the room, and as the door closed behind him, the shopping center had completely changed. Shaq looked around the room, seeing the employees still moved by the moment, seeing those who had chosen to stay, those ready to step into a new future. He nodded lightly, then spoke, this time without threat or warning, but with encouragement. "Today, we're not just working, we're building something better." And for the first time, this shopping center was no longer a place reserved for a certain group of customers. It became a place for everyone. The next morning, the mall opened as usual, but the atmosphere had changed. The marble tiles still gleamed under the lights. The stores still looked as dazzling as ever, but the people inside had changed. Shaq stood on the second floor, quietly observing what was unfolding below. No need for billboards, no need for big slogans, but everything had a new look. At the reception, where before only the most luxurious customers were welcomed, today the staff greeted everyone with genuine smiles, no longer making distinctions. A man in work clothes entered, hesitating and looking around as if unsure whether he should come in, but this time there were no scrutinizing gazes, no contemptuous stares. A staff member approached him and smiled. "Good morning. Welcome to the mall. Can I help you with anything?" The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if not believing what he had just heard. Shaq watched that moment, the corners of his lips curling slightly. This was the change he wanted to see. In the distance, the security team, who had been trained to keep an eye on guests whose appearance did not fit the mall's preconceived notions, today they no longer secretly followed those in casual clothes. One security guard, who only yesterday had ordered Shaq to leave, was now helping an elderly woman carry a heavy bag, politely guiding her to the resting area. In another corner, a sales assistant was serving a couple, but this time it wasn't because they wore designer clothes, it was simply because they were customers, just like every other customer. The woman in the couple couldn't hide her surprise. She turned to her boyfriend and whispered, "Do you remember? The last time we came here, no one even looked at us." "It's different now." He smiled and gently squeezed her hand. These small details were unfolding throughout the mall, a change that didn't come from a speech, nor from a written rule, but from the way people treated each other. Shaq slowly walked past the shops, observing the mall staff as they went about their work. Yesterday, they had carried the fear of punishment if they didn't follow the unspoken rules. Today, they worked with a completely different attitude, more confident, more relaxed, and, most importantly, no longer afraid. A staff member at the coffee shop noticed Shaq standing near the counter, her eyes lighting up slightly. She remembered the moment in the meeting when Shaq said that all employees deserved respect. She approached, no longer with the sneaky, fearful demeanor, but as a worker truly proud of her job. "Good morning. What would you like to have?" Shaq smiled lightly, looked at her for a moment, and replied, "One black coffee, and this time I'll pay later. Is that okay?" She paused for a moment, then chuckled softly. "Yes, of course." Both knew it was no longer a privilege rule. It was just a small joke, a sign that real change had taken place. In the afternoon, a man entered the mall, walking with some hesitation. He was one of the customers who had been kicked out for dressing too casually, who had felt the coldness and received contemptuous looks from the staff. But today, something was different. He walked past the jewelry counter, the place where, before, he'd been ignored when asking about a ring. The sales assistant, who just days ago had avoided customers like him, approached today with a sincere smile. "Hello? Can I help you with anything?" He blinked, stepping back slightly, as if not believing what he had just heard. But when he saw the staff member's gaze, no longer reluctant or judgmental, he nodded, slowly but firmly. "I'm looking for a ring." Shaq continued observing these changes from afar, knowing that things weren't perfect yet, but they were heading in the right direction. No one could change a culture overnight, but just one day, like today, had already set it on a new course. He turned back toward the exit where a group of senior managers stood. Some were breathing a sigh of relief, others still felt tense, but they all understood that the mall had turned a new page. Shaq paused, looked at them for a moment, and then spoke in a steady voice. "Do you see it? A mall doesn't need to discriminate against its customers to be successful. A business doesn't need to impose fear on its employees to function well." One of the managers, the one who had agreed with Shaq from the start, nodded gently, his face looking like he had just unloaded a burden. "I've never seen this mall so alive as it is today." Shaq just smiled lightly. This was only the beginning. He stepped out of the building, but this time He didn't walk away as someone who had been kicked out, like he had the first time. Nor was he someone trying to prove a point. He walked as someone who had changed an entire system, and most importantly, he knew no one would ever have to leave this place in shame again. Shaq stepped out of the shopping mall, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the shiny marble floor beneath his feet. A gentle breeze swept through the vast hallway, carrying the sense that a new day was truly beginning. Today, what he had witnessed was a significant step forward, but he knew that a battle couldn't end with just one victory. Immediate changes were necessary, but the more important task was sustaining them. He understood that the old system wouldn't just vanish after a meeting, a speech, or a day of enthusiastic work. There would be those who still longed for the old power, those who would try to hold on to their positions by imposing fear on others, and wealthy customers who had once been given priority might now feel their privileges were being invaded. And in the shadows there were still discontented eyes watching him. In a secluded corner of the mall, in a small management room, a group of people whispered about what had just happened. A few familiar faces, managers who once ran the place with an iron fist, people who had benefited from the old system, from selective customer policies, from pressuring employees to follow unwritten rules. The man in the expensive suit, the manager who had opposed Shaq in the meeting, stood with his arms crossed, a dark scowl on his face. "Do you really think this will last?" he asked, his voice low, scanning the people around him. "A shopping mall that doesn't cater exclusively to the elite? A place where anyone can walk in and be treated like a VIP? That's not how the world works." Another person spoke quietly, worry in their voice. "But Lancaster was fired. The board agreed with Shaq. What can we do?" The man chuckled coldly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Wait. Wait until this mall loses its high-end customers. Wait until the sales drop. Wait until Shaq gets frustrated and leaves." He lowered his voice, his eyes narrowing with a sharp glint. "Then we'll put everything back where it belongs." The others exchanged glances, some still skeptical, others starting to nod. But whether they agreed or not, they all understood one thing. Shaq had challenged an institution built on power and division, and there would be those who wouldn't give up so easily. Outside, Shaq stood on the grand steps at the mall entrance, his gaze sweeping over the employees slowly leaving their shifts. He saw the salespeople chatting with one another without the fear they once carried, saw the security guards smiling warmly at customers instead of eyeing them with suspicion, saw the baristas calmly setting up their stalls, no longer tense with the worry of being reprimanded for being too friendly to a customer who seemed out of place. These images made Shaq feel satisfied, but he wasn't under any illusions. He knew there were still those who wanted to fight this change. Those who were used to power would not give it up easily. Those who had benefited from the old system would find ways to restore it, in the most subtle ways. And Shaq had no intention of letting that happen. He took a deep breath, then turned to face the group of employees still standing nearby. They hadn't left yet. They were still waiting, still expecting something from him. Shaq looked at them for a long moment, then spoke, his voice not too loud but clear enough for everyone to hear. "We've only just begun." A light breeze passed by, carrying a moment of silence with it. There will be those who aren't happy. There will be those who want to return to the old ways. But let me tell you, we will not go back. We cannot allow this mall to be a place where only one group of people are treated like human beings while others are invisible. He paused, his sharp gaze sweeping over each face. No one spoke, but they were listening. Let this mall be a symbol of fairness. For the first time, applause broke out. At first, it was just a few scattered claps, but then it grew stronger, spreading, drawing in more and more groups. The employees who had once been afraid. The employees who had once been silent. The employees who had been threatened with losing their jobs if they dared to go against the unwritten rules. Today, they were clapping not just for Shaq, but for themselves. Because they had stood up, because they had chosen to change. Shaq nodded slightly. He knew that a bigger battle still lay ahead. But when he heard that applause, when he saw the eyes of those who had once been oppressed, he knew he wasn't fighting alone. The battle wasn't over, but this time he had an entire army standing behind him. Shaq stood still, feeling the cool breeze slipping through the layers of fabric on his body. The vast space in front of the shopping mall stretched out before him, but today it no longer felt like the place he first entered. Back then, he was just an ordinary customer, dismissed by a security guard who believed he didn't belong there. That day, he saw disdainful glances, fake smiles, and employees bowing, their heads in fear before a system that had been in place for too long. But today, everything had changed. The mall still stood there, as magnificent and luxurious as before, but the people inside were different. Employees greeted customers with sincere eyes, no longer judging them by their appearance. Security now helped customers rather than watched over them. Those who had been rejected, dismissed, or felt they had no place now entered with confidence. Shaq put on his sunglasses, his eyes following the flow of people passing through the large doors. In the distance, a working-class family was shopping for clothes in a high-end store they would have never dared to enter before. An older man, once watched by security for not looking like a potential customer, was now comfortably enjoying a cup of coffee in the mall's luxury area. He saw the young employees, once fearful of being fired for not adhering to unspoken rules, now working with a new spirit. They no longer feared being penalized for treating every customer well. They no longer avoided the gaze of their superiors, and they did their jobs with pride. The old managers who once upheld a culture of discrimination were now gone. Some left quietly, some remained but had to adapt, for they knew that the old world they controlled had crumbled. Shaq turned around, gazing at the mall one last time. He didn't need fame, didn't need thanks. All he needed to know was that anyone who stepped into this place would be welcomed as a human being. He smirked, a subtle but meaningful smile. Now, who doesn't truly belong here? Then he turned and walked away from the mall, knowing he would never need to return, because he had left something far greater than himself behind. He had left a symbol. And that is how Shaquille O'Neal transformed a shopping mall from a place riddled with discrimination into a symbol of fairness. From someone who was once turned away, he stood up, faced, and changed an entire system. Not with power or fame, but with persistence and a firm belief that everyone deserves respect. What do you think of this story? If it were you, what would you do when witnessing such injustice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories about justice, perseverance, and change, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to not miss the next inspiring story. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.